Welcome back to the Dancing Toaster. This is Nelly, and I want to start by thanking you for all of the wonderful birthday wishes and all the love you sent me last week. I really appreciate that, and as always, I appreciate you checking out the show. It means more than you know, and as a sign of that appreciation, I'm releasing part 2 of the Heaven's Gate Deep Dive that was for my members over on Patreon. If you don't know, I do a second show. It is called The Man-Eating Toaster, where I cover cults and true crimey things. For my members that are checking this out, and if you're like, man, I already heard this, well, you are now going to be getting an additional perk, one that I always wanted to offer anyway, and this is the perfect time to bust that out, and that is early access to the Dancing Toaster. So from now on, my patrons will be getting early access to the main show. I'll never trap the Dancing Toaster behind a paywall, but my members will get early access to the show, and will get the exclusive show, the Man-Eating Toaster. I got some new stuff boiling up for that show on the Patreon, and if you like what you're hearing, please go check out. There's a Scientology deep dive, another big two-parter that I did. And this month, I still have 2 episodes planned, but instead of doing a part 1 and part 2, I'm going to try and do 2 separate ones, either 2 smaller cults or lesser-known cults. But I've had some requests for some more true crime-esque stuff as well. So, yeah, excited to do that. It's something I find fascinating. So, making some decisions for my members this month. If you have suggestions, by all means, hit me up on the community tab. Let me know what you want from the Man-Eating Toaster. It is your show, so keep me in the loop on that with what you'd like to see. As for the rest of you, I'm super grateful for you. I hope you enjoy part 2 of the Heaven's Gate Deep Dive. You will get access to this week's episode of the Dancing Toaster next week. So it's in the works right now, and I can't thank you enough for all of the love, all the support, not just for my birthday, but every month, every week that you offer for the show. Please continue to love and support the show. Please continue to tell others about it. That's how it's going to grow. I can say it's a great show. It sounds really self-serving when it comes from me, but I work really hard, and I need your support. I need you to share, tell others what they're missing from the Dancing Toaster and the Man-Eating Toaster. Help me to grow this thing. Love you, and I hope you have a wonderful week, and enjoy this part 2.
Flight crew, please prepare for takeoff. Activation code required. Scanning. Login authorized. Evacuation sequence activated. Accessing archives.
911, what is your emergency?
Self-destruction. Planning to comply.
Officers are on the scene. In pursuit of suspect west on Hall Road.
Synchronizing. 80%.
Take cover!
Engage. Dust to dust.
March 25th, 1997. Inactive Heaven's Gate member Rio D'Angelo received a FedEx package. Inside he found 2 videotapes, one labeled Doe's Final Exit. This was Marshall Applewhite's last message. The other contained a compilation of farewell messages from all the members. There was also a letter attached. It read, "By the time you read this, we will have exited our vehicles." Rio immediately knew what had happened. The next day, he asked a friend to drive him from LA to Rancho Santa Fe to see it for himself. When he arrived at the Heaven's Gate mansion, he found the door unlocked and stepped inside. The house was eerily silent. Rio pulled out a video camera, knowing that Heaven's Gate had documented everything. He began filming what he saw. Room by room, he discovered the decomposing bodies of all 39 of his former friends. When he finally emerged from the house, he looked as pale as a ghost. He got into his car, pulled out his phone, and made a famous anonymous 911 call.
911, what is your emergency?
Yeah, I need to report an anonymous tip.
Okay, this is regarding what?
This is regarding a mass suicide. I can give you the address.
Welcome to Beyond Human, the last call. We have a big picture to try to portray to you.
Red alert. Hale-Bopp brings closure to Heaven's Gate. Whether Hale-Bopp has a companion or not is irrelevant from our perspective. However, its arrival is joyously very significant to us at Heaven's Gate. The joy is that our older member in the evolutionary level above human, the kingdom of heaven, has made it clear to us that Hale-Bopp's approach is the marker we've been waiting for. The time for the arrival of the spacecraft from the level above human to take us home to their world in the literal heavens. Our 22 years of classroom here on planet Earth is finally coming to conclusion. Graduation from the human evolutionary level. We are happily prepared to leave this world and go with T's crew. If you study the material on this website, you will hopefully understand our joy and what our purpose here on Earth has been. You may even find your boarding pass to leave with us during this brief window. We are so very grateful that we have been recipients of this opportunity to prepare for membership in their kingdom and to experience their boundless caring and nurturing. That disturbing message you just heard was the last update ever to be posted on the infamous website, heavensgate.com, a website that is still eerily available today with the same massive banner that reads, "As was promised, the keys to Heaven's Gate are here again in T and O, the UFO 2, as they were in Jesus and his Father 2,000 years ago." On the site you will also find some of their works. The following is an excerpt from their Extraterrestrials Return with Final Warning. An away team from an evolutionary level above human, an admiral and his captain and crew during the 1920s to 1950s picked and prepped the human bodies which they would wear for the task we are about to describe. They came into those bodies in the 1970s, the admiral and captain first. They began rounding up their crew in 1975 and assisting them in the process of entering and taking charge of their own assigned human bodies. They called their crew together by means of public statement and meetings over about a 9-month period. The media, typically hastily judging them, tagged them the UFO cult because of their expectation of leaving aboard a spacecraft at the completion of their task. The two then took the ones who followed them into seclusion, completely separate from the world for almost 17 years, not only completing their awakening or adjustment to their human bodies in this primitive civilization, but also took them through a metamorphic classroom experience of changing over their consciousness and behavior to match with that of their distant culture from whence they had come. This is but a taste of some of the madness that was taught by Bonnie Lou Nettles and Marshall Applewhite as they deceived people for decades and eventually led 39 other people to an early grave. My toasties, welcome back to the Man-Eating Toaster. This is part 2, our conclusion for the Heaven's Gate episode. We are late, but we are here. I want to start by thanking you for your patience. Thank you even more for your prayers. 2025 has been rough so far, and this week was probably not only one of the worst of the year so far, but one of the worst since we moved to Washington. But God is still good, and you guys are still awesome, and I still owe you an episode. We got a lot to cover, so we're going to dive right in. After securing their first group of devoted followers, Bonnie and Marshall felt it was time for yet another transformation. They had already cycled through multiple identities, first as Bonnie and Marshall, then as Guinea and Pig, and the Two. But it seems for them, reinvention was an essential part of their evolving mission. Apparently, their previous titles still didn't capture the full scope of their divine purpose. Their new monikers were Bo and Peep. Yes, as in Little Bo Peep. To me, this one is really on the nose because it clearly spells out how they see their new followers as their sheep. And with these new names, they were all well on their way to leading these people to the slaughter. For the sake of continuity and understanding, also for my sanity's sake, I'm going to continue to call them Bonnie and Marshall. All their nicknames are stupid, and we're not even done with all of them yet. We're still in 1975. Bonnie and Marshall continued peddling their poison, pushing forward with their recruitment efforts. Several hundred attended some of their seminars, and eventually their group grew to about 80 dedicated followers.
With the group now fully under Bonnie and Marshall's control, isolation is a main ingredient in the cult Kool-Aid. The group abandoned their traditional homes and began living a nomadic lifestyle together, moving between various campgrounds across the country. This transient existence wasn't just about avoiding detection. Again, it was a deliberate strategy to isolate followers from the outside world, cutting off any lingering ties to friends, family, or society as a whole. With each move, the rules governing their lives became more and more strange, more and more rigid over time. Followers were completely forbidden from contacting loved ones, as any outside influence could plant seeds of doubt and jeopardize their commitment. Personal expression was also stripped away. No jewelry, no facial hair, no distinctive clothing. I told you last episode they forbade drug use to their credit, but let's not give them too much credit. The simplest forms of self-indulgence, like drinking alcohol or eating unapproved foods, were strictly prohibited. But it wasn't enough to control what went into their bodies. A major step in so many cults is controlling what people do with their bodies. One of the strictest rules Bonnie and Marshall implemented was any form of sexual activity, whether inside or outside the group, was absolutely forbidden. Bonnie and Marshall taught that to be accepted onto the spacecraft, their promised vessel of salvation, followers needed to purify themselves completely. This went beyond intimacy. It didn't just mean rejecting materialism or earthly desires. It meant erasing their very sense of self. Individuality was seen as a weakness. Even gender was a hindrance. They were all to become androgynous, indistinguishable from one another, and entirely obedient to Bonnie and Marshall. The next piece may seem a bit odd. It makes sense to forbid contact with the outside, but in Heaven's Gate, even human relationships within the group were discouraged for a long time. I'm not talking about romance. Remember, that's already forbidden explicitly. Members were not to form close friendships or discuss their personal interpretations of the teachings even amongst one another, as Marshall feared that even a single seed of skepticism could spread and unravel their delicate belief system. Instead, they were trained to look only to their leaders for guidance. Whenever a decision needed to be made, no matter how small, followers were instructed to ask themselves a question. It wasn't the familiar, "What would Jesus do?" mantra of traditional Christianity. Nah, they went full blasphemy on this one. What would Bonnie or Marshall do, was the question. This shouldn't surprise anyone, as they already told the group that Marshall was the return of Christ. But just like that, their autonomy was erased, replaced with unwavering submission to their self-proclaimed extraterrestrial messiahs. The followers were sometimes presented with the illusion that they could make some choices, but ultimately, to go against Bonnie or Marshall's directions or even recommendations would get them ousted from the group. As Heaven's Gate grew in size and devotion, understandably, the families of its members began to panic. Seemingly overnight, their loved ones had abandoned their careers, abandoned their families, sold off their homes, and disappeared without a trace, following two self-proclaimed prophets who promised salvation via extraterrestrial ascension. Letters and phone calls went unanswered. Parents, siblings, and old friends were left wondering how someone they had known so well could so easily sever every tie to the world they had been a part of. Concerned families reached out to law enforcement, private investigators, and eventually the press. As more reports emerged of missing individuals who had cut all contact with their past lives, the media started to take notice. CBS News ran a segment on the growing phenomenon, highlighting the bizarre and alarming nature of this movement. Investigative journalists started looking into Bonnie and Marshall's teachings, dissecting their claims, and pointing out inconsistencies in their so-called divine revelations. The skepticism of those who saw through the cult's teachings quickly spread, and soon the movement became a target of ridicule. The media, in particular, mocked the idea of an intergalactic rapture, rightly portraying Bonnie and Marshall as delusional charlatans. But while the public laughed, the true believers within the group saw it differently. To them, this wasn't mockery, it was persecution. Another through thread from these types of groups is the reframing of criticism. The more the movement is criticized, the more validated the parties feel. With Heaven's Gate, the more criticism they received, the more they felt convinced that they were onto something. This was the truth. This is an easy sell for cult leaders, to be honest. It's framed like, after all, didn't all the divine figures face opposition? Wasn't Jesus himself rejected by society? Members of Heaven's Gate saw the media attention as validation. They were certain that soon the demonstration, as they called it, the grand supernatural event where Bonnie and Marshall would be killed, resurrected, and taken aboard a spacecraft in front of witnesses, would silence all the naysayers, all the doubters, once and for all. But Bonnie and Marshall didn't share that enthusiasm. For the first time since forming their little group, movement, experiment, whatever they want to call it, Bonnie and Marshall were on the defensive. The growing attention from the media wasn't the kind they wanted. It wasn't reverence, it was mockery. The more they were criticized, the more their credibility crumbled. They couldn't afford to let outside voices plant seeds of doubt among their followers. Instead of embracing the publicity, they withdrew. Heaven's Gate retreated into secrecy. This is where I question the sincerity of Bonnie and Marshall, though it's not the only time I'll do this. They're one of those cults where most of the time it looks as though they actually believed the mess that they were peddling. Unlike, for instance, Scientology with L. Ron Hubbard. That guy didn't believe any of the crap he spouted. It was all a grift. It was all to gain wealth and power, of which he obtained both in abundance. But again, he was a grifter. Bonnie and Marshall, most of the time, seemed quite sincere in their beliefs and never really amassed the wealth and the power that typical charlatans will obtain. They are really freaking wrong, but they seem to be drinking their own Kool-Aid, at least most of the time. There are cracks, though, that I see peeking through that make me wonder if this too wasn't some strange delusional grift. You keep promising this so-called demonstration, you start building up the heat and confrontation needed for such a demonstration to occur, but then you bail. Now, you and I know it was never going to happen. They weren't going to be struck down, and they certainly would not have come back to life if they had been. But again, if they really believed it was going to occur, wouldn't you have wanted this so-called persecution? Again, just makes you wonder. Anyways, they go back into seclusion and out of the limelight. Bonnie and Marshall instructed their followers to continue recruiting, but now they would do so more subtly. No more seminars. Now the followers would go out in pairs, traveling in twos to spread the word while keeping a low profile. I believe this is another demonic mockery of the Bible and of Jesus, by the way. In Mark 6, verses 7 to 9, it says this, "And he called the 12 and began to send them out, 2 by 2, and gave them authority over the unclean spirits. He charged them to take nothing for their journey except a staff, no bread, no bag, no money in their belts, but to wear sandals and not put on 2 tunics." Meanwhile, Bonnie and Marshall themselves faded into the background, avoiding public attention and public scrutiny. It appears that for them, the mission wasn't about convincing the masses. It was about solidifying their most loyal disciples. By early 1976, the movement was now officially calling itself Human Individual Metamorphosis, and the member count had gone from 80 to nearly 200 followers. Side note, I know I keep calling them Heaven's Gate. They wouldn't formally adopt that name for many more years. I'm just using it because it's the most well-known. But in 76, they were again Human Individual Metamorphosis. HIM, H-I-M, probably yet another blasphemous mockery of the truth. But here's the thing. Living under strict rules, waiting endlessly for a spaceship that never came, and isolating themselves from the world was not a lifestyle that everyone could sustain. Doubts began creeping in. Some followers quietly left, unable to handle the intense discipline, while others simply lost faith and grew tired of waiting for the mothership. When the group finally reconvened, nearly half the members had abandoned the movement. But to Bonnie and Marshall, this wasn't a loss, it was a cleansing. This is another easy thing to spin for cult leaders. Rather than lamenting the departures, they framed it as divine selection. All you have to say is, the ones who left simply weren't ready. The true believers were the ones who remained, and they were now part of something much more exclusive. In fact, Bonnie and Marshall had 2 major announcements that would change the course of Heaven's Gate forever. The first announcement was, the harvest is over. In other words, recruitment had officially ended. At least for now. Heaven's Gate would no longer be seeking new followers. From now on, the group would focus solely on the devoted few who had proven themselves worthy. Again, this marked a major turning point, the transition from a growing movement to an exclusive, insular cult. The second announcement that was made was even more shocking. Bonnie and Marshall revealed that they had received a divine message from the next level, the higher plane of existence they were preparing to ascend to. According to this message they received, the so-called demonstration was now off. Remember the demonstration? The whole Bonnie and Marshall are going to be publicly killed and then resurrected for all to see? Yeah, the new divine message they received from the aliens was that there would no longer be a demonstration. There would be no death of Bonnie and Marshall, no miraculous resurrection, no public proof of their divine mission. The world would not witness them being taken into the spaceship. Their reasoning? How did they sell this crap to the group? Well, they had died. You see, the media had killed them, metaphorically of course, with its harsh scrutiny. They claimed this was the equivalent of biblical prophecy for their deaths. The spectacle they had promised would no longer take place. Instead, followers would now have to believe in blind faith. For many cults, a failed prophecy often signals the beginning of the end, the beginning of their downfall. When a leader claims that an event will occur, whether it be an apocalypse, a second coming, or a divine ascension, when it doesn't happen, followers tend to question and others tend to leave. The illusion is broken. But in many cases, like with Heaven's Gate, it can have the opposite effect. It can be twisted. For some of the remaining members, this was yet another test of faith. If they had once followed Bonnie and Marshall because they expected proof, now they followed them despite the lack of proof. Their commitment was no longer about logic or evidence, it was about devotion. But this also demonstrates another common occurrence among cults and various sects. When a prediction fails, it can be spun by saying, "Oh, but it did happen. It just happened spiritually." A good example of this is the Jehovah's Witnesses and the 1914 prophecy. The Watchtower Society, head of the J-Dubs, initially predicted significant eschatological events for the year 1914. They expected visible, transformative occurrences upon the earth. When these events, of course, did not happen as expected, the leadership conveniently reinterpreted the prophecy, asserting that the events had indeed occurred, but in an invisible way. It happened in the spiritual realm. This reframing suggested that while the anticipated physical manifestations were absent, the prophecy was fulfilled in a non-physical sense, thereby preserving the credibility of the leadership and the faith of the adherents. This phenomenon is closely tied to the psychological concept of cognitive dissonance, something we'll talk a lot about on this show. This occurs when individuals experience psychological distress upon encountering information that conflicts with their deeply held beliefs. To reduce this discomfort, they often modify their understanding of events to align with their expectations. In the case of failed prophecies, for example, leaders and followers may reinterpret the outcome as a symbolic or allegorical or spiritual fulfillment rather than an outright failure. This reframing allows them to maintain their faith in the group's teachings and avoid the unsettling reality that the prophecy failed, that it did not unfold as expected. Such tactics demonstrate the extraordinary measures that groups take to uphold their doctrine and retain the loyalty of their members, even when confronted with undeniable contradictions. Here's one more example that's a little more uncomfortable, famously known as the Great Disappointment of 1844. In the 19th century, a preacher named William Miller and his followers, known as the Millerites, predicted that Jesus would return on October 22, 1844. They believed this event would mark the beginning of the end times, with Christ visibly descending from heaven to establish his kingdom on earth. When the day came and went without any sign of Jesus, the movement faced a massive crisis. Many followers were devastated, some even abandoning their faith entirely. However, rather than admitting the prediction was completely wrong, a group of Millerites reinterpreted the event to preserve their belief system. A man named Hiram Edson claimed to have received a revelation that the prophecy had actually been fulfilled, but conveniently it was fulfilled in heaven, not on earth. According to this new explanation, Jesus had entered the heavenly Holy of Holies to begin the final phase of his work, a process that would later be known as the investigative judgment. This belief became foundational to what would eventually become Seventh-day Adventism. This is a textbook case of how failed prophecies are often spiritually reinterpreted to avoid disillusionment, allowing a movement to survive even after its original predictions do not come to pass. Now let me be clear, I'm not equating J-Dubs and SDAs. I'm merely pointing out that multiple groups within Christendom that have obsessed over eschatology have gotten themselves into trouble. J-dubs are a Christian cult. SDAs are not classified as such. Read Dr. Walter Martin's take in his famous work, The Kingdom of the Cults. Though the closer one gets to Ellen G. White, the muddier it gets as well. But that's a whole other issue for another time. I simply wanted you to see just how prevalent this is. It's not just on the fringe. With this shift, Bonnie and Marshall tightened their grip on their followers even more, and they would undergo one final transformation. To further mark the group's transformation, Bonnie and Marshall renamed themselves one final time. From now on, Bo and Peep would be known as T and Do. These stupid names derived from the musical scale, yes, as in Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Sol, La, Ti, Do. A seemingly random choice, but one they claimed represented a higher level of understanding of the universe. Marshall, now Do, later spilled the beans and said the new stupid names came from Bonnie's favorite movie, which was The Sound of Music. This was his weird way of honoring her. Whether or not there was a deeper meaning behind the names, one thing was clear: Bonnie and Marshall were no longer just two eccentric prophets, they were now godlike figures to their followers. And their newly anointed official class of less than 70 members, those who had passed every test of faith, would follow them to the bitter end. Bonnie and Marshall, as T and Do, solidified their core group of followers, but they now faced a new challenge: how to keep their devoted believers occupied while they awaited their cosmic salvation. Unlike mainstream religious movements which engage followers in community outreach, worship services, or structured theological study, Heaven's Gate had no tangible mission beyond preparing for the spaceship they believed would arrive to take them to the next level. With no clear timeline for the UFO's arrival, Bonnie and Marshall needed a way to sustain morale and keep their members from growing restless or disillusioned. To maintain discipline, they enforced strict daily routines focused on mental and spiritual purification. Much of the time was spent meditating, reflecting, and cleansing their thoughts to ensure they were spiritually prepared to ascend. Members also further practiced detachment from earthly desires, reinforcing their belief that their bodies were merely vehicles meant to be discarded at the appointed time. But despite their rigid structure, life within the group wasn't entirely devoid of leisure. According to some, they weren't quite seen as friends, but they were approachable and at times even playful. To prevent boredom and maintain a sense of unity, the group engaged in various group activities to pass the time. Board games and word puzzles encouraged strategic thinking. Movie nights were often organized using a generator, where they watched films that aligned with their ideology. Science fiction, yes. Science fiction books were a popular pastime as well, reinforcing their belief in extraterrestrial life and the like. And at night, members would take turns scanning the skies for UFOs, believing their intergalactic transport could arrive at any moment. Several times, Bonnie and Marshall claimed to have received visions that the spaceship was near. Each time, members packed their belongings, preparing for departure, only to wait endlessly under the stars, watching for a vessel that never came. Yet instead of losing faith, they rationalized the false alarms as either tests of devotion or misinterpretations of their divine messages. Their belief system remained unshaken. Over time, some followers grew weary of the lifestyle, not because they had lost faith, but because the endless waiting wore them down. Some members simply became exhausted by the strict rules and the expectation to abandon all individuality. By 1979, their numbers had dwindled to just 40 loyal believers. However, the remaining members had become deeply connected, not just as cult followers, but as a surrogate family. Recognizing that prolonged uncertainty and instability could further weaken the group, Bonnie and Marshall decided it was time for another major shift. They would move into actual houses. They settled in rented homes across different states, maintaining their belief in secrecy. But despite this new sense of stability, they refused to stay in one place for more than 6 months. Why, you ask? Well, the families of the cult members were growing increasingly concerned. Many of them have even banded together by this point to search for the family. Private investigators were being hired, law enforcement was starting to take notice of the group's activities, and if they remained in one place too long, they risked media exposure, legal intervention, or even a forced deprogramming of their members. By this point, Heaven's Gate was no longer just a spiritual movement, it had become a tightly controlled, highly isolated sect, and Bonnie and Marshall knew that for their mission to succeed, they needed to keep the outside world as far away as possible. But one major factor would make this increasingly difficult: money. By the 1970s, Heaven's Gate had moved from its nomadic campground hopping phase and settled into rented homes across multiple states, as we said. While this shift brought a sense of stability, it also presented serious problems, namely financial problems. Previously, the group had managed to sustain itself through large financial sacrifices from new recruits. Followers were expected to sell their possessions, drain their savings accounts, their retirements, and surrender their inheritances to the collective fund. But as time passed and recruitment slowed, these funds began to run dry. Bonnie and Marshall knew that if they wanted to keep their operation afloat, they needed a steady income. However, their strict doctrine made this difficult. The members of Heaven's Gate had spent years isolated from society, convinced that the world outside was corrupt and spiritually poisonous. They had no assets, no individual financial autonomy, and most importantly, no personal identity outside of the cult. To solve this problem, Bonnie and Marshall decided that a handful of followers, those deemed skilled enough to blend into the workforce and not be compromised, well, they would take jobs in the outside world. These members would be responsible for earning enough money to support the entire group. Of course, there was a major issue. They couldn't risk members getting recognized or being traced back to Heaven's Gate. To prevent exposure, those sent to work were required to adopt fake names and keep all social interactions to an absolute minimum. Meanwhile, the remaining members stayed home, continuing their spiritual training and handling domestic tasks like cooking, cleaning, and maintaining the group's rigid daily schedule. Surprisingly, even with just a dozen members working at any given time, the group was able to pull in around $400,000 a year. $400K in the 1970s is no small feat. This is the equivalent to approximately $1,900,000 in today's money adjusted for inflation. Considering how frugally they lived, buying groceries in bulk, wearing identical outfits, and avoiding unnecessary expenses, this was more than enough to sustain all of them. However, this new system only reinforced what Bonnie and Marshall had been preaching all along. Individuality was dangerous. The group had been conditioned to believe that personal desires and independence were obstacles to their ascension to the next level. And so, as Heaven's Gate settled into new financial structure, Bonnie and Marshall took this doctrine to the next level, preparing to strip away every last remaining bit of individuality from their followers. Heaven's Gate wasn't just about obedience, it was about erasing the self entirely. Bonnie and Marshall believed that the only way to prepare for their ascension was to detach completely from human desires, emotions, and individuality. To enforce this, they instituted extreme uniformity in every area of life. Every moment of the day was scheduled down to the minute, down to what members ate, when they slept, when they worked, and even how they performed basic hygiene. Everyone was allotted the same exact amount of money, down to the cent. If you remember from last week, eventually it'll be down to that $5.75 in their pockets when they passed. Shaving had to be done in a precise manner. All members had to follow even the same strokes of the razor. Haircuts were identical for men and women, not only eliminating individuality, but eliminating gender altogether. Clothing was uniform, no jewelry, no accessories, no room for self-expression whatsoever. This wasn't just about discipline. This is demonic psychological warfare, folks. By eliminating personal choice, Bonnie and Marshall ensured that followers had nothing left to cling to except them and except the teachings they had been fed for years. However, one aspect of human identity posed a unique challenge: sexuality. Bonnie and Marshall preached that in order to ascend to the next level, followers needed to become pure, genderless, and completely free of sexual urges. Any form of sexual desire, even in thought, was seen as a barrier to reaching the next level, their extraterrestrial destiny. For some members, simply suppressing their urges wasn't enough. They wanted to prove their complete devotion to the cause. And so, in a move that seems unfathomable to most people, some of the male members voluntarily chose to undergo surgical castration, as voluntary as it can be in a cult-like environment. This wasn't just symbolic, it was a permanent, life-altering medical procedure. Unlike a vasectomy, which only blocks sperm, castration involves the complete removal of the testicles, which results in a permanent loss of testosterone production, a drastic reduction in sexual function and libido, and a physical transformation that would further reinforce their genderless identities. One follower, after undergoing this sick procedure, was even quoted as saying,
I can't tell you how free this made me feel.
For them, this wasn't mutilation, it was liberation from their earthly desires because they had become so warped. And it perfectly exemplified the level of psychological control Bonnie and Marshall had over their followers. Initially, the group considered getting the castrations done professionally by seeking out surgeons in the U.S. However, there were two major problems with this. One, the medical community hadn't been demonized yet by trans ideology, so no licensed doctor would perform such a procedure without a medical necessity. No ethical medical professional would agree to remove healthy, functioning parts off of a person's body without a legitimate medical reason. Sadly, we have hundreds of unethical ones around today that have been hacking parts off of people left and right, again thanks to the alphabet mafia. This is demonic, it's straight up evil. The libertarian-minded live and let live folks even went along with this psychotic behavior until they started doing it to hundreds of kids. I'm praying all of the reassignment nonsense and false gender-affirming care, that demonic lie, all that nonsense needs to be banned nationwide in my opinion. Hopefully it will be soon. But I digress. There was a second reason they didn't go the professional route, and that was the attention such an act would garner at that time. Again, there seemed to be a little more sanity in that regard back then. They then considered traveling to Mexico, believing they could find a doctor willing to perform the operation for cash. However, after researching their options, they determined that the conditions in the clinics they found were too unsanitary, and they feared potential health risks. While wrestling with that option, some of the male members volunteered to be the first to undergo castration, but rather than waiting for a professional surgeon, they decided to have it done internally within the cult. A fellow cult member, Julie Lamontagne, I hope I'm saying that right, a former nurse, she would attempt the procedure in a makeshift surgical setting within their house. Marshall allegedly made a sign that said Mexico and hung it over the door, which is why some documentaries you listen to say that the procedures were done in Mexico. That was not the case. He hung the sign up so that if anything went wrong and the law got involved, they could claim the procedures were done in Mexico. Interestingly, they were eager for the procedure. They actually fought over who would get to go first. One guy wins the coin toss. He was called Soroti. We'll explain that stupid name in a second. Soroti goes into the room called Mexico, and Julie administered shots to numb the area. She then made the incision to remove the testes. However, it went horribly wrong. Afterwards, Soroti's satchel began to swell, and he was in insane amounts of pain. They're flipping out, they didn't know what to do. They were terrified to take Soroti and his sliced up satchel to the hospital because they weren't sure if they broke the law or not. They hesitated. They hoped the swelling would go down, but as time passed, things got worse, not better. They would have to get him some medical attention. They basically do a drive-by, they drop off Soroti at the ER and quickly got the heck out of there. The most awkward detail, and you're like, wait, this gets more awkward? Oh yeah. While Soroti is in the ER, some of the other cult members drive to the pier and throw his dangly bits into the ocean. Wouldn't want the cops finding Soroti's satchel. When questioned by doctors, they reportedly gave a vague excuse, and since the patient refused to give details, the authorities didn't pursue an investigation. Two more members understandably bounced during the castration situation. I'd say good on them, but their daughter was interviewed and said that her parents eventually went back to the cult, so we won't give them too much credit. Even with all of this insanity, 7 other men still had the procedure, though it's debated if Julie carried out the rest of them or if they got someone else to do it. Now, Soroti. What on earth kind of name is that? I'm glad you asked. As if eliminating material possessions and personal relationships and testes and gender identity wasn't enough, Bonnie and Marshall, still going by T and Doe, took one final step to erase any remaining traces of individual identity. They were going to change everyone's names. Members were given matching last names, Odie, This was meant to symbolize that they were the spiritual children of T and Do. But their first names, those became whack and unrecognizable. Each member was required to remove all vowels from their original birth name, keep only the first 3 consonants, and then attach Odie to the end. For example, someone named Brandon would be Branody, and don't ask me if I'm saying that right or not. It doesn't matter. It's a made-up stupid name anyway. Somebody named Linda would become Lindody. Yeah, my brain hurts just thinking about this. Over time, this ridiculous naming system evolved further. Long-term followers had their names shortened even more, dropping the final Y to make them even more abstract. So Branody would become Branad, I guess. I don't know if I'm saying it right. Again, it doesn't matter. They're stupid made-up names. The result? Well, followers are no longer individuals. Heck, followers no longer even sounded like human beings at this point. With all that, we finally hit the 1980s. By the 80s, Heaven's Gate had transformed into a completely isolated, highly controlled, and psychologically regimented group. Members no longer had personal identities. They were androgynous, uniform, and obedient to every command of Bonnie and Marshall. They worked jobs under fake names, funneling money into the cult while keeping their true mission a secret. They had stripped away every last trace of individuality, believing it was the only way to reach the next level. This was no longer just a UFO cult, it was a complete system of dehumanization. And yet, despite all of this, the spaceship never came. Heaven's Gate, still not quite with their famous name, had become completely isolated from the outside world. Followers were not allowed to contact family members. This was something that would increasingly be cracked down upon as time progressed. But this also was where the biggest hypocrisy could be seen, again questioning whether or not these two really believed what they taught. All cult leaders have rules for thee, but not for me. Heaven's Gate was no different. Behind closed doors, it was later discovered that Bonnie had been secretly writing letters to her oldest daughter, Terry. Bonnie even sent her money from the cult's coffers. So while she expected her followers to cut off all contact with their families, she was still in touch with her own daughter. Again, rules for thee, not for me. Later, when Terry would meet with some of the surviving cult members and former cult members, and she would share some of the letters that she received from her mom, many of them were incensed. They were told for so long that they weren't allowed to, and yet Bonnie was hypocritically doing it behind their backs all along. Even in some of those later letters, encouraging Terry to live a normal life in the world. Did Bonnie really believe the nonsense that she was peddling? I guess we'll never know. Marshall, well, he would have done the same, I'm sure, but his family wanted nothing to do with him. But something strange popped up in 1982. After years of the zero communication policy, out of nowhere, Bonnie and Marshall decided to allow members to write home for Mother's Day only. Perhaps this was some of the guilt wearing Bonnie down a bit. Another shocking thing happened the following year. In '83, they were allowed to visit home, but they had to lie to their families and say that they had been studying computer science at a monastery. This was a rare moment where members were able to see their families again, but it was insanely risky from a creepy cult leader perspective because it made some of the members start to question everything. But before any of them could really act on these questions or doubts, something happened that changed everything. Something that marked the beginning of the end for Heaven's Gate. For years, Bonnie Nettles, known now as T, had refused to seek medical treatment, teaching others that she was an immortal higher being. According to her own teachings, she and Marshall had been sent from the next level, occupying human bodies as mere vessels until their eventual transformation. Because of this, she dismissed any notion that she could suffer from something as earthly as disease or death. However, in 1983, after experiencing persistent health issues, Bonnie reluctantly agreed to a medical checkup. The results were devastating. She was diagnosed with metastatic melanoma, an aggressive form of cancer that had already begun spreading throughout her liver and right eye. Doctors warned her that immediate treatment was necessary, but she stubbornly refused to accept what she saw as their reality. She dismissed the diagnosis entirely, even though it cost her an eye, telling her followers that the doctors were simply mistaken and that her body was invincible. To acknowledge her illness would mean acknowledging that she was just as human as everyone else, and that was something she couldn't allow. Sadly, some of this same poison exists in Christianity thanks to the wicked prosperity gospel. The prosperity gospel, also known as the Word of Faith movement, teaches that faith alone can bring wealth, health, and divine favor, and that any form of suffering, sickness, or financial struggle is a sign of weak faith or a lack of divine blessing. Just like Bonnie rejected the idea that she could get sick because of her supposed spiritual superiority, prosperity preachers push the idea that true believers should never suffer. Many well-known televangelists and megachurch pastors promote dangerous teachings such as,
God doesn't want you to be sick.
implying that all illness is due to a lack of faith,
If you claim healing in Jesus' name, you'll be cured.
ignoring the reality of suffering in a fallen world,
Poverty is a curse and God wants you to be rich.
equating financial success with divine favor.
Sow a seed and God will bless you.
Now give me money, I'm going to exploit you financially by promising you miracles in return for cash. These teachings are spiritually destructive, much like Bonnie's delusions. When reality contradicts the prosperity gospel's promises, followers are left devastated, feeling betrayed or blaming themselves for not having enough faith, or worse, blaming God for breaking promises that He never made. Nowhere in Scripture does God promise a life free of sickness, poverty, or hardship. In fact, the Bible warns us that suffering is a part of the Christian life and a reality on this side of heaven. John 16:33,
In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, for I have overcome the world.
Jesus says. 2 Corinthians 12:9 is where Paul begged God to remove his affliction, but God said,
My grace is sufficient for you. My power is made perfect in weakness.
Then there's James chapter 1 where he says, Consider it pure joy, my brothers, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Coming from the Bible Belt, I believe that the prosperity gospel is even more dangerous than Heaven's Gate. Heaven's Gate's lies are blatant and way out there in outer space, literally. Yes, they misuse the Bible to help peddle their nonsense, but the Word of Faith fraudsters misuse the Bible even worse and even more. And much like Jim Jones, they acquire a lot of wealth and power along the way. Yes, Heaven's Gate took 39 lives. We have no way of knowing how many victims, though, the prosperity gospel has taken. Not to mention the incalculable souls that have been led to hell because they were taught Jesus is an ATM and a doctor instead of a Lord and Savior. I'm not saying God doesn't heal today, folks. He can and He has. I've seen it. I'm not saying God doesn't bless people monetarily. I've seen that too. The issue is the idolatrous focus on these things, health and wealth, and the guarantee that every Christian will have them. They won't. Guys like Kenneth Copeland are demonic and are way more dangerous than Marshall Applewhite ever was. But that's a talk for another time. T, or Bonnie Nettles, wasn't the first or last person to deny reality in favor of a comfortable delusion. The prosperity gospel encourages the same mindset, leading people down a path of disillusionment, suffering, and even death when reality does not align with false expectations. If Bonnie had admitted her mortality, maybe Heaven's Gate would have ended differently. And if the church as a whole would reject the prosperity gospel, maybe fewer people would be left devastated when life doesn't turn out the way a false preacher promised it would. True Christianity does not deny suffering. It gives hope in the midst of it. While Heaven's Gate preached escape and the prosperity gospel preaches denial, Jesus preaches redemption, endurance, and the promise of eternal life, even in suffering. All that being said, we've mentioned thus far several of the cult's beliefs here and there, but let's take a moment to take a focused look at the actual belief system of Heaven's Gate. Of course, a major part of their belief centered around a major cult theme. It seems to be something a cult can't go without, and that's a doomsday prophecy. Marshall and Bonnie made sure theirs was as nuts as possible. At its core, Heaven's Gate taught that Earth was doomed, destined to be recycled, they said, meaning wiped clean or renewed by an advanced alien race by the year 2027. The world as we know it would be destroyed. According to Bonnie and Marshall, there is no chance of survival unless you follow their specific path to achieve something called TELAH, T-E-L-A-H. Cults love their acronyms and special vocabulary, don't they? TELAH stood for
the evolutionary level above human. To escape Earth's imminent doom, members had to transcend their human existence. As we've pointed out a few times, they had to purge themselves of all earthly attachments, gender, family, individuality, material possessions, and elevate consciousness to a higher evolutionary level. You hear the Darwin peeking through? Yep, that's not by chance either. The idea was, hey, once we've done this successfully, the alien spaceship will come to Earth and rescue us, transporting us to the new plane of existence called the next level. This higher plane was depicted as a physical, perfected place, free of human suffering, death, and corruption. But there was one small catch. They could only board the spaceship if they had fully rid themselves of their earthly and human nature. That meant absolute obedience to Marshall and Bonnie's teachings, strict discipline, zero room for doubt. For years, Heaven's Gate operated under the assumption that its leaders were divine alien guides sent to usher their followers into the next level. But in 1985, something happened that shattered the prophecy. Where we're going to go next in our accounting of the cult's history, spoiler alert, Bonnie's life will be taken by the cancer. This, of course, would be a huge problem for the cult. Bonnie wasn't just any old member. She was supposed to be one of the celestial beings guiding humanity to ascension. According to their original teachings, she was supposed to physically transform and be taken up in a spaceship, not die of a terminal illness like an ordinary human. Her death should have been the end of Heaven's Gate. The entire foundation of their belief system should have collapsed in that very moment. But Marshall wasn't about to let an inconvenience like reality get in the way of their carefully crafted garbage. Marshall completely reworked the prophecy to explain Bonnie's death away. He now claimed that physical bodies weren't actually needed to ascend to the next level. Instead of a literal alien abduction, members would leave their bodies behind, a process he called exiting their vehicles. If someone had reached Tela before death, their consciousness would be uploaded into the alien mothership even if their physical body had died. In other words, dying was now a part of the plan. With this change, their entire doctrine pivoted. Bodies were no longer sacred in the same sense. They were now seen as temporary vessels, meat sacks that carried the soul around until it was time to leave the earth behind. From that point forward, Heaven's Gate members spoke about their bodies as if they were disposable shells. Death would no longer be feared. It would be seen as the moment of true ascension. But I'm getting ahead of myself, sorry. Let's wrap up some of their whacked out theology before returning to that story. Let's talk a little bit more about the next level, Heaven's Gate's vision of salvation. For many religious groups, heaven is seen as a spiritual realm, a paradise that exists beyond the physical world. But for Heaven's Gate, the next level was not so intangible. It was not an intangible afterlife, it was a literal, physical planet, one that existed somewhere in deep space, inhabited by highly evolved extraterrestrial beings. Marshall and Bonnie taught their followers that once they successfully shed their human limitations, they would ascend to this planet and become something far greater than human and far greater than humanity. They would become perfected beings, free from all the corruptions of earthly existence. No more hunger, no sex, no sexuality, no individuality. In their new form, they wouldn't even need food. Instead, they would absorb pure energy from sunlight to sustain themselves. Yeah, you heard that part right. They believed they were going to Krypton. No, just kidding. Well, kind of. These people truly believed that they would transform into light-eating, androgynous alien super beings. So after years of strict discipline, suppressing all human desires, and even castrating themselves, what was the reward? Becoming some kind of celestial houseplant. Imagine cutting off your genitals, cutting off your emotions, cutting off your family, giving up everything you've ever known to be reincarnated or reestablished as Groot, a sentient tree. Heaven's Gate, of course, didn't see their beliefs as just another fringe religious movement. No, of course. They believed that all religions throughout history had been teaching the same core truth, but that over time they had become corrupted by evil forces, similar to what Mormons and Muslims say. Except their version of God wasn't a supernatural being. Rather, they claimed that the one true God was a highly advanced, highly intelligent alien, the supreme ruler of the next level. But what about the opposition? They did demonize the world, but did they believe in demons or Satan? Again, the answer is, well, kind of. As with any successful cult, there has to be an enemy. There has to be a villain who stands in opposition to the mission. Heaven's Gate ironically called their enemies the Luciferians. Now don't be fooled into thinking these were demons or spiritual forces as you or I might understand them. Nah, the Luciferians were supposedly humanoid extraterrestrials, but they were not benevolent. They were master deceivers, false gods who had infiltrated Earth to corrupt humanity and prevent them from ascending to the next level. And they weren't just any aliens. These beings, according to Heaven's Gate, had some terrifyingly advanced technology as well. They apparently possess holographic projection technology. This is what allows them to create fake miracles to manipulate humans into following them. They also have time travel capabilities, enabling them to control history and shape human civilization. Of course, telepathy. They got telepathic powers that allow them to influence people's thoughts and emotions. And they, of course, possess immortality. Heaven's Gate taught that Luciferians had achieved eternal life, but used it to enslave humanity rather than enlighten it. According to Marshall, every major religion on Earth had been twisted and perverted by these Luciferians. The Bible, the Quran, Hindu texts, you name it, everything had been rewritten to keep people from discovering the real truth that only he and Bonnie knew, of course, that the true God was an alien and that humanity's only hope was to follow Heaven's Gate. As members of my Patreon, you get an inside scoop into Season 3 stuff with aliens since we're talking about a UFO cult here. Heaven's Gate taught that angels and demons are actually aliens. The Bible says the exact opposite. Aliens are actually angels and demons, folks. The Earth has been visited by foreign beings, but they are not extraterrestrial, meaning they are not from another planet. They are from another dimension. They are extra-dimensional. They are from an unseen realm that exists alongside ours. Heaven's Gate got a lot wrong, but since you listen to The Dancing Toaster, you know that we get a lot wrong about angels and demons and spiritual beings. When the show started, a major thread that runs through the show is the idea that heavenly beings can and have taken on physical forms and interacted with the world. And when they've done this, when they've interacted with the world, it's produced all kinds of things from Nephilim to technological advancements to false belief systems. If you study religions and cults, you know the most successful lies always come wrapped in a little bit of truth. This is why the actual Lucifer, Satan, had Bonnie and Marshall use and abuse the Bible so much. Heaven's Gate also had some strange views on possession. Ironic views when you really think about it. Unlike most religious groups, they didn't believe in spirits or demons taking over human bodies. Instead, they believed, you guessed it, in alien possession, something they called walk-ins. According to their teachings, human bodies, or vehicles as they like to call them, were nothing more than empty shells, and sometimes an elevated extraterrestrial consciousness could simply walk in to a person's body, taking it over completely. So in a way, your body was basically a cosmic Airbnb, folks. If it was vacant, a higher being could just move in and take control. And here's where it gets even more demonic. Marshall and Bonnie told their followers that they themselves were walk-ins. They claimed that they were no longer human, that their original souls had vacated their bodies, and now their forms were being inhabited by alien entities sent from the next level. Marshall told his followers that his alien spirit was the same one that had possessed Jesus of Nazareth. According to Applewhite, the savior of humanity was not the Son of God, but rather the host of an extraterrestrial intelligence. Bonnie is just as blasphemous, if not more so, as the higher being that took over her, according to these fruit baskets, was the one that we see as the Father. So they claim the same intelligences had returned, this time inside the bodies of Bonnie and Marshall, to lead their followers to the next level. The ironic thing is, I believe they were onto something to a degree. What do I mean by that? Well, again, the ironic thing is they were both possessed, folks. Demons were clearly all over these two. Well, and all in these two. Remember, they met in a psychiatric hospital, and Bonnie was involved in every form of sorcery she could get her hands on, and she introduced old Bug Eyes to these ideas too. I believe they both held the door wide open for actual demons to have a field day in them and through them. The pull they had over their members went well beyond psychological, in my opinion. I believe Bonnie did have interactions with otherworldly beings that lied to her and to Marshall, telling them what they wanted to hear in order to destroy them and destroy anyone else who listened to their nonsense. This is why the Bible tells us, folks, to test the spirits by the Spirit to see if they be of God. If they deny the uniqueness of Christ, they are not of God. If they deny the deity of Christ, they are not of God. The Bible also warns in Galatians, if anyone comes bringing a gospel contrary to the one given to us by the apostles, even if it's an angel, let them be cursed. Without the real Jesus, without his Holy Spirit, these two and their followers couldn't see that they were involved with evil, otherworldly beings destined for hell. Now, we got to wrap this up so we can get back to the history lesson. If a lot of their ridiculous nonsense sounds familiar, there's good reason for that. One of the most influential beliefs that Heaven's Gate pushed was something that has since become mainstream in many UFO circles, and that's the demonic idea that aliens created humanity. Decades before shows like Ancient Aliens made the idea wildly popular, Heaven's Gate was preaching that extraterrestrials had seeded the Earth with human life thousands of years ago. Now, this is a major scientific theory, by the way. Panspermia, look it up. They taught that every ancient civilization had been trying to communicate with their creators, the aliens. They taught that the gods of mythology were actually advanced alien beings who had influenced human history. And now the aliens were returning to harvest their creation, choosing only the most evolved humans to ascend to a transhuman state. Those who fail to evolve, according to Bonnie and Marshall, would be left behind, doomed to live in a decaying world poisoned by corruption, greed, and spiritual decay. This was essentially their doctrine of hell. Get stuck here, that was hell. Because remember, they also believed in reincarnation. And the only way to save yourself from this fate, well, you gotta listen to Bonnie and Marshall, of course. As much as people rag on Heaven's Gate, many of their warped ideas have been rebranded and have gone mainstream. Yeah, some of the religious wrapping has been removed, but it's still a UFO religion that's followed by a lot of those ancient alien nutcases, as well as some that really don't want to believe in God or the Bible. So they look to so-called science, and it's been greatly influenced by science fiction when you get into panspermia and stuff like that. The only thing they are even close to getting right is the idea that powerful otherworldly beings have been involved in human activity on Earth. Where they fail so miserably is actually due to naturalism and materialism. Things we dump all over on the dancing toaster. There's no God or angels or demons. There's aliens. Everything is aliens to these people. What's so wild about Heaven's Gate is that their beliefs didn't disappear with their mass death in 1997. If anything, their core ideas have become even more popular today. Again, the belief that aliens seeded humanity, it's huge. The idea that ancient civilizations were trying to signal extraterrestrials, it's everywhere. The idea that we're on the verge of a great cosmic awakening. Just look at the modern spiritual movements. A lot of Bonnie and Marshall's ideas have been repackaged and rebranded within a lot of the New Age movement. Because Satan and the Kingdom of Darkness use the same bag of tricks, folks. Because they work. Heaven's Gate may have self-destructed, but their ideology lives on, whether people see it or not. Now we gotta move on or I'll never get through this episode. When we last left Bonnie and Marshall, Bonnie had been diagnosed with cancer. Despite Bonnie's denials, the disease progressed rapidly. By 1985, her condition had worsened significantly, and her followers could no longer ignore the truth. The woman who had promised them transcendence, who claimed they needed their bodies intact to ascend to the spaceship, was now physically deteriorating before their very eyes. On June 19th, 1985, Bonnie T. Nettles succumbed to cancer at the age of 57. Her death shook the group to its core, especially Marshall. They had been led to believe that they would physically ascend to the spaceship, leaving Earth behind in their human bodies. Yet T, Bonnie, their divine guide, their leader, their literal connection to the next level, had just died. Like any other mortal. Where was the spaceship? Why hadn't she been healed? Why hadn't she transformed or transfigured? Why didn't the aliens come to retrieve her body? Some members began to question everything. If Bonnie, the person who had started Heaven's Gate, the woman who claimed she had direct communication with the other side, with higher beings, if she could die just like anyone else, well, what did that mean for the rest of them? Marshall had to act fast. If too many followers lost faith, the entire cult could collapse. We mentioned this a moment ago. It was time once again to rewrite the narrative. You already know a new doctrine would be formed, a new revelation would conveniently explain away the proof staring them in the face. Marshall did what cult leaders do best. He reframed the narrative. He gathered the group together and told them that Bonnie had not truly died. Her body had simply failed to contain her powerful next-level consciousness. He explained that Bonnie had ascended spiritually without needing a spaceship because her spirit was too evolved for this world. Guess who else pulled this crap the following year? Scientology did. After the death of L. Ron Hubbard, about 7 months later, January 24th of 1986, he and his cult are coming soon, folks. But they pulled this same nonsense, that he just ascended, that this world and his body just couldn't contain him. For Heaven's Gate, once again, this was a drastic shift from their original teachings and beliefs. Up until that point, the belief was that their physical bodies would be transformed and taken aboard the spaceship. But now Marshall had no choice but to reinterpret their entire theology to account for death itself. Instead of physically boarding a UFO, their ascension would now happen spiritually, but only after they willingly left their human vehicles behind. In other words, death was now not only part of the plan, death was the plan. With Bonnie gone, Marshall Applewhite was left alone at the helm of Heaven's Gate, a responsibility he neither wanted nor was he mentally prepared for. Though he had always been the group's charismatic face, Bonnie had been the quiet force holding it all together, the one who gave structure to their increasingly bizarre belief system. Without her, Marshall spiraled into paranoia, depression, and delusions even more extreme than ever before. He had lost his co-leader, his closest companion, and the person he believed was guiding them all to the next level. Now he had to make a choice, either admit that everything they had built was a lie or rewrite their doctrine to fit this new reality. We already know he chose the latter. For the remaining followers, Bonnie's death was deeply unsettling. They had been told for years that they needed their human bodies to ascend, yet here was their leader, dead. No transformation, no celestial retrieval, no proof that anything they had believed was true. Marshall, consumed by grief and fear of losing control, refused to acknowledge that Bonnie had simply died like any other human being. Instead, after grieving for about 7 years, close to 8, he reframed her death as proof of her superiority. Her consciousness was too powerful for a human body to contain, so she had ascended ahead of them to prepare the way. It was a necessary shift in doctrine to keep the group from collapsing. Because if Bonnie, their guiding force, could die, then again, what did that mean for them? If she wasn't immortal, then their entire belief system would unravel, should have unraveled. So Marshall made sure that didn't happen. Instead of ascending bodily into space as originally planned, he now told his followers that their spirits, not their bodies, would be what ascended. The human body, once thought to be necessary for transformation, was just disposable. It was a disposable vehicle now. And when the time came, they would need to leave their vehicles behind. In other words, death was now the only way to reach the next level. In the months following Bonnie's death, Marshall withdrew from the group, locking himself away in what seemed to be a deep depression. For the first time, his carefully crafted delusions were being tested. He had lost his father, he had lost his wife and children, and now he had lost Bonnie, the only person he had ever truly felt connected to. Though he was surrounded by devoted followers, it wasn't the same. No one understood him the way she did. No one could validate his beliefs like she did. And so Marshall reached a breaking point. But instead of dissolving the group or admitting defeat, again he emerged from the 7-year depression with a new revelation. He claimed that Bonnie had sent him a message from the next level. She was waiting for them all. But to reach her, they would have to shed their human shells and free their spirits from their earthly prisons. For the first time, shadows of suicide were becoming central to Heaven's Gate's doctrine, and no one was questioning it. Throughout the late 1980s, Heaven's Gate entered a period of mourning. Though many followers remained faithful, the energy of the group had changed. Bonnie had been the balance, she'd been the glue, the one who structured their teachings in a way that gave people comfort. Without her, Marshall ruled with unchecked authority. His paranoia deepened. As he further lost his grip on reality, his grip on the remaining followers would tighten. The group became more isolated than ever. Contact with the outside world was cut off completely. Gone were the days of reaching out to family on Mother's Day and the like. And dissent was no longer tolerated to any degree. They never became traditionally violent like so many cults of the time, but if anyone began to question Marshall's new teachings, well, they quietly left or were highly encouraged to do so. By 1990, their numbers had dwindled to just 26 members, a fraction of what they had been before. Because of this, Marshall would go back on another previous edict. Marshall resumed active recruitment efforts for Heaven's Gate. In 1992, the group produced a 12-part video series that was broadcast via satellite called Beyond Human.
Welcome to Beyond Human, the last call. We have a big picture to try to portray to you.
It would function as the last call to humanity where they aimed to disseminate their teachings to a broader audience. In a desperate attempt to revive their dwindling movement, Heaven's Gate also took out a $30,000 advertisement in USA Today on May 27, 1993. The ad was an urgent call to action warning people that the end was nigh and that Earth was on the verge of being recycled. It framed Heaven's Gate as the last opportunity for salvation, urging potential followers to join before it was too late. The group also included a P.O. box address in the ad inviting people to write in for more information about their teachings and mission. Alongside this, members began mass-producing VHS tapes featuring Marshall now fully assuming his role as the messianic leader of the group, delivering impassioned speeches with his bug eyes about their beliefs. These tapes were mailed to interested parties, further spreading the group's message. Determined to reignite their movement, Heaven's Gate even returned to their old methods of the 70s. They hit the road and held in-person meetings across the country in an all-out attempt to recruit new members for the cult. However, times had changed. The world was far less receptive to their message than it had been almost 2 decades prior. The in-person seminars, which at one point drew hundreds of eager attendees in the 70s, now attracted mostly skeptics, curiosity seekers, and outright hecklers. The atmosphere at these gatherings often turned awkward and in some cases outright humiliating for the group. One particularly painful incident occurred during a meeting south of me in Portland, Oregon. The group members were standing at the front of the room trying to present their beliefs when suddenly a man in the audience raises his hand, expecting an earnest question. One of the members calls on him to speak. Instead of a question, the man openly challenged them, saying,
Yeah, this isn't the first time your cult has visited Portland. Back in the 70s, 2 people calling themselves Bo and Peep came here trying to recruit followers for a spaceship to take them to heaven. So, did that ever happen?
The room fell dead quiet. The tension was unbearable. The second-hand embarrassment levels were nuclear. The members, caught completely off guard, had no choice but to admit, no, the spaceship had never come. The moment was excruciating and embarrassing public exposure of their movement's long history of failed prophecies. Beyond the skepticism over their UFO beliefs, many attendees also criticized the members for abandoning their families and children, pressing them on whether they had regrets. It became clear that public interest had shifted. In the end, the meetings were an utter failure. They managed to recruit only a handful of new followers, but a few former members, now disillusioned with life outside the cult, ended up returning. Recognizing that their traditional recruitment tactics were no longer working, the more technologically inclined members of Heaven's Gate turned to this new blossoming thing called the Internet. We typically see them as only insane, but they were insanely ahead of their time in this regard when they launched heavensgate.com, a website which is uncomfortably still up and available to this day. I read much of it in preparing for this. My head still hurts. I read some of it for our opener today. The website became a digital extension of their mission, filled with information about their teachings, their prophecies, and their leader, Marshall, who was still going by Doe. As Heaven's Gate entered the digital age, Marshall seized the opportunity to share his doctrine with the whole world in a way that had never been possible before this. With the help of his followers, he launched a website that served as both an informational hub and a recruitment tool. But Applewhite wasn't just trying to gain new members. He was issuing a final warning happening to humanity. In a lengthy and impassioned online manifesto, Applewhite made a radical and earth-shattering claim. He was the second coming of Jesus Christ, sent to Earth once again, not in a divine spiritual form, but as an alien consciousness inhabiting a human body. His mission, as he saw it, was to gather the worthy and prepare them for ascension before the Earth was recycled. According to him, those who refused to evolve beyond their human limitations would be left behind, doomed to perish with the planet. Applewhite emphasized the urgency of their mission. The world was on the brink of destruction, and the only way to escape, well, was to shed your earthly vehicle and transcend to the higher plane of existence, the next level. There, where they would no longer be human, but rather pure, perfected extraterrestrial beings, free from suffering, free from individuality, free from corruption, free of their brains, well, free of the world that they were leaving behind. This was the first time a group had really done anything like this using the internet. I know that's hard for us to see now because we're so used to the internet. It'd be the first time many were hearing this message of Heaven's Gate. But for those of you familiar with the internet, you probably know how this went. The internet has always been a rough place. The internet was not the sanctuary Applewhite had hoped. Rather than attracting devoted seekers eager to join his ranks, the website became a magnet for ridicule and mockery. The internet has been wild from day one, folks. Even back then, online users laughed at his claims, flooded their forums with skepticism, and sent a relentless wave of cruel, sarcastic, and dismissive messages. In the emerging world of internet culture, Heaven's Gate was not seen as a group of enlightened pioneers, but rightly seen as a delusional cult, a punchline in a rapidly growing online community that had little patience for outlandish nonsense. For Marshall, this backlash was devastating. He had truly believed that the world was waking up, that there were people out there who would recognize the truth of his message. He had held on to the hope that Heaven's Gate could offer salvation to more than just the handful of followers still by his side. But now he saw that humanity had made its choice. The world had turned its back on them. This wasn't just rejection to Applewhite, this was proof. Proof that the world was beyond saving. Humanity had refused the offer of ascension, and in doing so, had condemned itself. There was no longer any reason to delay. The spaceship wasn't coming for Earth, it was coming only for the chosen. This disillusionment became the final push that led Applewhite and his followers to make their faithful decision. If the world had rejected them, they would reject it in return. Earth was no longer their home. The next level was calling, and they were ready to answer. As the 1990s rolled in, Marshall was fixated on one thing: finding a sign that it was time to leave Earth. He had convinced his followers that their only escape from this world was death, but there needed to be a reason, a catalyst, a moment, a cosmic event that would serve as their signal. The Branch Davidians had their whole debacle in Waco, which sickly inspired Marshall a little bit. They considered going out and trying to buy a bunch of weapons and stir stuff up and get the attention of the law on them and try to commit death by cop. But the cult kind of pushed back surprisingly on that, saying, well, but what if it doesn't work, and what if we don't all die? And reason didn't really prevail when you consider what happened after, but yeah, to be inspired by David Koresh just goes to show you how gone this man is at this point. In 1995, the signal finally appeared. The Hale-Bopp comet was discovered. Our opener from last week's episode, on July 23, 1995, Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp discovered a new comet. One viewing from New Mexico, the other from Arizona. From the moment Marshall heard about it, he was certain that Bonnie had sent it. This was the sign. I think of Tully in the Ghostbusters, the Keymaster. This is the sign. This was the indication that their time had finally come. Their graduation to the next level was on the horizon. Heaven's Gate was heading towards its final tragic chapter. As the Hale-Bopp comet drew closer to Earth, an actual conspiracy began spreading through the UFO community about it. It all started on Art Bell's show, Coast to Coast AM, a popular show that discusses the paranormal and conspiracy-driven topics. One night, an anonymous listener sent Bell an image supposedly taken by an amateur astronomer that showed a mysterious object trailing behind the comet. The image, paired with the claim that NASA was covering up the truth, set off a wave of speculation. Some believe the object was a spaceship hidden in the comet's tail, an extraterrestrial vessel traveling alongside it. Marshall Applewhite ate this up. He latched onto this idea instantly. To him, it wasn't just a spaceship, it was the spaceship, the one they had been waiting for, and Bonnie was on it. She had to be. After more than a decade of waiting, he was finally certain this was the sign they had been waiting for. Bonnie was returning to lead them home, he thought. Marshall wasted no time in delivering the news to his followers. Hale-Bopp wasn't just a comet, it was the exit strategy. He declared that the spaceship traveling behind it was here to transport their souls to the next level, but there was one condition. They had to leave their human bodies behind to board it. But to Marshall and his followers, this wasn't suicide. They didn't see it as death at all. Remember, to them, it was graduation. To them, hell was staying here. For years, they had been training their minds, shedding their earthly attachments and preparing for the moment when they would finally transcend. Now they're being told that the moment had arrived. This was their great escape from Earth, from suffering, from a world that they had never belonged in. Their departure was to be a joyous occasion, a long-awaited transformation into celestial beings. The countdown to Heaven's Gate's final act had begun.
And let me say that our mission here at this time is about to come to a close in the next few days. We came from distant space and even what some might call somewhat of another dimension, and we're about to return from whence we came.
As graduation day approached in early 1997, the group made their final preparations. They moved into a lavish $1.6 million mansion in Rancho Santa Fe, California, a stark contrast to their previous life of strict discipline and minimalism. They spent all of their remaining money not just on essentials, but on luxuries they had denied themselves of for years. They traveled together, visiting places they had never been: SeaWorld, Vegas, Mexico, San Diego Zoo. For a brief moment, they indulged in the earthly pleasures that they were about to leave behind. They ate at expensive restaurants, gorged on buffets, and even made trips to Taco Bell. But behind the smiles and laughter, they were recording their final goodbyes. Each member filmed a farewell video, speaking to the world that they were about to leave behind.
Hi, sorry. We are interviewing a number of people just to see a number of people express an interest in saying something on camera to the people that might, get this tape. And we just wondered if you had anything particularly you wanted to say to people.
Well, I just want to let everyone know how lucky and happy I feel to be here, and let you know that what we're about to do is certainly nothing to think negatively about. We're all choosing of our own free will, go to the next level with T and Doe. And they are certainly not what the media is going to paint them out to be. I never got to meet T in this incarnation in her human vehicle, but I can tell you that Doe is the most special, dignified, unhuman, objective person that you can ever meet. That's right. He has helped us so much and put up with so much and never done anything that seemed even close to the way a human would respond.
They're so uncomfortable to watch and not hard to find. When you hear them, they don't sound afraid, they don't sound sad, they sound elated. For them, this was not an ending, it was the beginning. Even Marshall, who spent years in deep paranoia and depression, seemed more alive than ever. His purpose was finally clear. He was about to lead his people to their promised land, the next level, and at last he would be reunited with T. On March 17, 1997, Heaven's Gate sat down for their last meal together, a Marie Callender's in Carlsbad, California. The entire group, dressed in identical outfits, ordered the exact same meal: iced tea, salad with tomato vinaigrette dressing, turkey pot pie, and blueberry cheesecake. They ate in silence, forks clinking against their plates, no one speaking about what they were about to do. They paid the bill, left a generous tip, and walked out into the cool California night, never to be seen alive again. That night they returned to the mansion to prepare for graduation. If you listened to last week, you know what happened next. The process was carried out with chilling precision. Over the course of 3 days, all 39 members of Heaven's Gate carried out the final steps of their ascension. Each one took phenobarbital, a powerful sedative mixed into applesauce or pudding. They washed it down with vodka. Plastic bags were then placed over their heads to ensure asphyxiation. One by one, they laid down to die. Each wave of deaths was carefully managed. One group passed away, the remaining members would remove the plastic bags, arrange the bodies neatly in the beds, and cover their faces with the infamous purple shrouds. Marshall himself was among the last to go. By March 22nd, he lay down on the master bed, awaiting his own transformation. 2 of his most devoted followers following next, except there was no one left to tend to them. It was March 26, 1997, when a disturbing, anonymous tip led police to Heaven's Gate Mansion.
On my way to the call, I was kind of trying to, in my mind, contemplate how I'm going to tell the people the residents that I'm going to, hey, the reason I'm here is because somebody, I think it's a prank or something like that. And when I went up the driveway, that's when things started just changing a little bit, let's say. You start feeling something's not right. Just so happened that the last door that I came to was like a side entry door into the residence, and they had left that unlocked. You almost start to get tunnel vision, but then you started seeing the bodies everywhere because there was a room next to the foyer that they just had bunk beds out, and then there were cots and just bodies everywhere. Now, what was strange for us is that they're covered up. I mean, everybody's dressed in a black Nike jumpsuit with Nike shoes, and they've got a purple shroud over their head, and they've got a patch that says Heaven's Gate Away Team on the side. There's a computer that's like Star Trek that's flashing red alert on the thing. It's like you're kind of pinching yourself going, is this really happening? When our partners arrived, that's when we decided to go back in and go through the entire house, and it was just the 2 of us, and counted out how many people were there and what rooms they were in. And I basically checked people for signs of life by rigor mortis. And there was obviously nobody alive in the house.
Inside, they found a scene straight out of a nightmare. 39 bodies, perfectly arranged in beds, all wearing identical black sweatpants, black shirts, and brand new Nike Decade sneakers. Each person had exactly $5.75 in their pockets. The matching clothes were typical of their everyday cult behavior. The Nike Decades have become a point of fascination for some people. Some used to think it had some symbolic importance, when in fact the only reason they all had Nike Decades was because they all wanted to match and they got a deal on that shoe buying it in bulk. Look that shoe up now, the 93 Nike Decades. I think they morbidly go for thousands of dollars as the Heaven's Gate shoe. People are weird. People have also obsessed over the $5.75 found in all their pockets. Now, why $5.75? Turns out it was a nod to a few things. Marshall Applewhite was reportedly fascinated with Mark Twain, particularly because Twain was born in 1835 and died in 1910. Why does that matter? Well, both years were years when Halley's Comet was visible. Twain even famously predicted his own death would coincide with the comet's return, saying, "I came in with Halley's Comet in 1835. It is coming again next year, and I expect to go out with it." This idea of celestial bodies signaling life and death aligned perfectly with Heaven's Gate's core beliefs. Applewhite saw comets as spiritual markers, just as Twain seemed to. It's believed that the $5.75 was a reference to a Mark Twain story, possibly his 1895 essay, Extracts from Adam's Diary, in which Twain humorously suggests that souls need to pay a fare to board a celestial vessel. Some researchers suggest that amount, the $5.75, though not mentioned by Twain, was the cost of a bus ticket in California at the time, possibly representing the idea of paying for their final journey to board a celestial vessel. Given Heaven's Gate's obsession with blending their religious ideology with pop culture and sci-fi elements, it makes sense that they would assign a physical fare to their cosmic trip. The idea of money with death, even for a ticket or a toll, did not originate with Twain nor Applewhite. This idea goes back to Greek mythology and resembles the myth of Charon, the ferryman of the underworld who required payment to transport souls across the Styx. Typically, a coin would be placed in the mouth of the deceased. In any case, the official cause of death was ruled mass suicide, but many cult experts today argue otherwise. There are many that say this was not 39 suicides. They argue that the Heaven's Gate tragedy was 38 murders and only 1 suicide. Many claim that these people were not of sound mind. They argue the cult members were manipulated, brainwashed, and coerced into these dark actions. Marshall Applewhite had led them to their deaths and then, only at the very end, had taken his own life. Now, what do I think? I think it's more complicated than that. Yes, Applewhite does shoulder a serious portion of the blame, so too does Bonnie, but these people that followed them were adults, intelligent ones at that. Here you had Joker and Harley Quinn fresh out of the psych ward claiming to be alien space Jesus and his female father, warning you, stop having sex and cut off your genitals and join me on the spaceship with E.T. God. Come on. Bonnie and Marshall are guilty of spreading destructive lies. I'm not going to argue that, but to put it all on them is just outright wrong in my opinion. You see, we all have a responsibility to investigate our beliefs, to test them, to see if they are true. This cult had plenty of warnings, plenty of failed prophecies, plenty of blatant contradictions laid out before them. The Bible blames the false teacher, but it also blames the one who follows them off the cliff, or in this case, onto the spaceship. Like I said, to this day, the Heaven's Gate website remains active. It's run by 2 members who still believe in the group's teachings. I am shocked by that. Mark and Sarah King, who reside in Arizona. They were part of the group since its inception back in '75 and have continued to uphold its demonic digital presence. Why are they still here, you ask? Why didn't they go with Applewhite on the spaceship? Why did they get left behind? You'll be shocked when I tell you it's solely because they were chosen by old Bug Eyes himself to stay behind so they could run the Heaven's Gate website. No kidding, that's it. That's why they were spared from the vodka and spicy applesauce and purple cloth. Because Applewhite wanted some to stay behind on Earth to run his stupid website. You can't make this stuff up, folks. The cult also teaches reincarnation, so these 2 geniuses think that they'll just continue to get reincarnated to run the website for the next 2,000 years until the spaceship comet does another drive-by. How could they still believe in this crap after all this time? After all that happened? Spiritual blindness is no joke. The fallenness of man never ceases to amaze me. After D'Angelo made that anonymous 911 call, the deputy from the San Diego Sheriff's Department was sent to the scene. We covered that in our intro last week, too. At first, he assumed the call was a hoax. It sounded too bizarre to be real. When he arrived at the mansion, he knocked on the front door. He got no answer. He checked the side, found it unlocked, stepped in, immediately overwhelmed by the smell of death. Still, he assumed it was just a few bodies, but as he moved deeper into the home, he realized quickly the full scale of the tragedy. He had to call for backup. More deputies arrived, each one shocked by what they found. The smell was so overpowering they had to wear face masks before continuing the search. The media, of course, quickly caught wind of the story, and within hours, news helicopters were circling the mansion. At first, investigators assumed that all the deceased were men. The matching outfits and ugly haircuts made them think it was a bunch of strange monks in Nikes. It wasn't until they inspected the bodies closer that they realized there were actually 21 women and 18 men, all ranging in age from 26 to 72 years of age. As the investigation unfolded, news stations around the world began covering the story. The idea that a cult had taken their own lives to board a UFO was so bizarre, it became a global headline overnight, unsurprisingly. Reporters gathered outside the mansion, helicopters circling above still, and conspiracy theories exploding across the internet. The tragedy of Heaven's Gate sadly didn't end in March 1997, no. Several former members who had left before the mass suicide felt immense guilt for not having joined their friends. Between 97 and 98, at least 3 former members took their own lives, believing they had missed their chance to join the next level. One former member, Chuck Humphrey, attempted to recreate the mass suicide, but was found and saved in time. A year later, in 98, he successfully ended his life, believing he would finally reunite with his fellow members. The grip that Applewhite had on these people is wild. To this day, there are still people who believe in this demonic cult that we know as Heaven's Gate. At least 2 that we know of are still paying for and running the stupid evil website that led to so many deaths and sent so many souls to hell. The Kings still claim that Marshall's teachings were real and that one day Heaven's Gate will return to collect new members. They say that all the while their website has a statement against suicide. Cognitive dissonance seems to be one of the most powerful forces on Earth. The cult's legacy has also left a lasting impact on pop culture, from documentaries to TV shows. The Heaven's Gate tragedy has been referenced in countless films, books, skits, and podcasts like this one. But at the end of the day, it's important to remember that this is not just a bizarre cult story. It was a real tragedy, a reminder of how dangerous religious lies and cult manipulation can be. These were real people who had real families, careers, dreams before they threw it all away to follow 2 nutcases. After everything we've covered, the question still remains, what is it about cults that makes intelligent, rational people abandon their lives? Well, that's not a simple answer to give. I think it's part spiritual, part psychological, even part circumstantial even. These sick cults typically search for people when they're at their lowest point, and they claim to have answers and hope. Scientologists do that hardcore, posting up in places, coming out of clinics and out of counseling sessions, finding people that clearly look sad or depressed, and then tricking them to fall down this pit of demonic lies and despair. How can you avoid being swallowed up into this pit or one like it? John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free. My friends, walk in the Spirit of God, become intimately familiar with the truth of God's Word, and you'll be able to spot the demonic counterfeits when they show their disgusting little heads. I want to thank you for listening. Thank you for your love and your support of the Dancing Toaster and now the Man-Eating Toaster. Lord willing, I will see you Tuesday on the Dancing Toaster, and 2 Thursdays from now, get ready for another cult deep dive. And I kind of already seeded where we were gonna go next. I hope you're enjoying the Man-Eating Toaster as much as I have enjoyed making it. As always, don't consume toasters, but don't let any toasters or creepy cult leaders consume you. I love you. I'm out.